This month for UMEIT Zoom, we thought we would take the time to give some brief updates on significant ecumenical meetings that have taken place in the last month and a half. One is of a global nature and the other two are US based, and I'll share about all three, and then I hope we'll have a few moments for some questions. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that you're seeing it should say the World Council of Churches, because that's where I'm starting. Good, okay. So the first is the Assembly of the World Council of Churches, which gathered in the end of August through the beginning of September in Karlsruhe, Germany. The WCC is a fellowship of 352 communions who come together for fellowship, to reflect visible unity, and to share a joint witness. And this was the 11th, only the 11th time that the group has gathered as an assembly since the formation of the WCC in 1946. And this time about 4,000 Christians came from all over the world. The United Methodist Church had at least 60 people in attendance in some capacity. And Bishop Dick thinks that that number might actually be even closer to 100. Because United Methodists were there as delegates and advisors and presenters and WCC staff, stewards, Getty students, and observers. Our delegation, I am kind of proud to say, was half young adult and included, and the pictures on the right, Bishop Sally Dick, Bishop Gaspar Domingos, Mr. Bird Bonner, Paul Gomez, Reverend Jessica Lowe, Reverend Sarah Bach, Reverend Ann Jacobs, Reverend Dr. Connie Simi Mea, Reverend Josh Swanson, and Mr. Roland Fernandez. Bishop Marianne Swenson was also a part of the delegation, as she has been for the last 8 years, serving as the vice moderator of the WCC. Bishop Harold Ruckert and I were also a part of the delegation as advisors. There were 2 days of pre-assembly gatherings prior to the start of the assembly, including one for young adults, one for differently abled persons, one for Indigenous persons, and one for women and men seeking gender justice. And I attended the latter. Each were really good opportunities to hear from people around the world and then craft the statement for the assembly. The assembly began every day with opening worship under a huge tent in the middle of the assembly area, which was in the middle of the city. And the worship was diverse and alive with choirs and cantors and ensembles and instruments and icons and incense and liturgies and visible symbols and thousands in the congregation. Every delegate was put into a Bible study home group, so there could be conversation shared about the scripture passage from the opening worship service, and these groups met all week. Every delegate was also put into a conversation group. For example, I was in the group that was discussing ecumenical theological education, and it was fascinating to hear views about decolonizing theological education around the world, about how to better cooperate around the world, about how theological education really should be for both laity and clergy. And each conversation group like that one sent suggestions to the full assembly. Every day there was also an informational plenary about the topic of the day, and the themes included care of creation, Christianity in Europe, the wholeness of life, justice and human dignity, the origins of our unity. And greetings were offered in person and via video from persons like the President of Germany offered greetings, Cardinal Cook of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity, the head of the Jewish Committee for Interreligious Consultations, Justin Welby, who is the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Aza Karam for Religions of Peace, who is the one pictured here on the lower left, Pope Francis, and the Orthodox Ecumenical Patriarch. Every day, a networking zone was also open and available to all participants. And here's where additional gatherings happened, like the one for women of African descent, which is the picture in the upper right corner. the one for Bosse graduates, and the one for my particular seminary. And every day there was also a Brunnen available to all participants and for anybody from the town, actually, because it was basically a series of small tents lining the road and the sidewalk, in which different parachurch organizations offered information as well as items for sale. So I purchased this new style of clergy women's collar from the Korean clergy women's booth. And I just wanted to show it to you, and I'll put in the chat, if I can figure out how to do that in a few minutes, the name of it. It's a Romella collar, and it just snaps on and off like that, which I thought was pretty cool. So free advertising for them. Okay. During the last several days, the full assembly met together in plenary for decision-making, which was all done via consensus using orange and blue cards, as you see here in upper right. Strong statements against the war in Ukraine were offered by several people, and that's with delegates both from Russia and Ukraine there in attendance. Statements were made in favor of doing something as Christians about the global climate crisis, and an affirmation of peace in the Middle East and peace on the Korean Peninsula. Commitments for young adult inclusion were offered. A desk for differently abled persons in the WCC Center was established. A commission on health and healing was founded. A reference group on gender justice was created. A library of resources for ecumenical formation was confirmed, and a commitment that the WCC pilgrimage ministry would be revisioned. For this 8-year period, the United Methodist Church will have 2 representatives on the Central Committee, Bishop Sally Dick and Reverend Ann Jacob, who is in the red dress in the upper left corner, and they'll begin their work in the spring. And the new General Secretary-elect, Dr. Jerry Pillay of South Africa, who's pictured bottom right, was introduced and shared his vision. It was noted by our delegation, and I do want to report that the United Methodist Church has been giving over $600,000 to the World Council of Churches on an annual basis. And this is from the gifts of the Council of Bishops, from United Women in Faith, and Global Ministries. So it's all of the gifts together, but that amount is likely not sustainable, and the WCC has been notified of this. So next, I want to talk a minute about the annual Forum of Christian Churches Together in the USA, which met October 4 through 7 in Indiana. It was the first in-person meeting in 3 years. And while the numbers were a bit down, only a few over 50 participating, it was to be celebrated, and it went very well. Christian Churches Together was founded in 2002 to be as broad a table as possible of Christian voices in the United States. And it's set up in 5 families, including Orthodox, Catholic, Historic Black, Evangelical Pentecostal, and Historic Mainline Protestant. And it makes all decisions by consensus and strives to be a gathering of Christians who are more interested in knowing about each other and talking together about a particular topic than a group who wants to be out in front making social justice statements. Its gatherings follow a particular process of prayer, consensus training, reminders of our own humility, faith sharing, introduction of a topic, theological sharing by each of the families, and then discernment of possible collective actions. 2022 gathering was in downtown Indianapolis, and each of the families led a time of prayer from their tradition, which included getting to go on field trips to local Catholic, Orthodox, Baptist, and United Methodist church buildings. Here you see the Catholic space. Participant representatives were sent into small groups to share a bit about their faith journeys with each other. Then Ms. Adele Banks of Religious News Service and Reverend Adam Taylor, who's on the right, shared presentations to set the stage for the topic, which this year was who does Jesus call the churches to be in a time of political polarization? Which is a great topic. So then diverse presentations were offered from each of the 5 families, and speakers included this, and this is an incredibly diverse list: Dr. Amy Ullman from Georgetown University, Reverend Dr. Emmett Dunn of the Lot Carey Baptist Foreign Mission Convention, the very Reverend Dr. Chad Hatfield of St. Vladimir's Seminary, Mrs. Gloria Gaither, yes, the Mrs. Gloria Gaither of Gaither Ministries, and then Reverend Terry Hord Owens of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. In the midst of the learning together, the participant representatives also took a pilgrimage trip to the Circle in downtown Indianapolis and to the Inner Church Center. The stop at the Circle, which is what you're now seeing, was a time of lament for our culture's focus on war and having to always win. The stop at the Inner Church Center was a time of reception by Christian groups currently in ministry in the Indianapolis area, including Christian Theological Seminary. So consensus decision-making honors all members of the group that are present, but it can also be super hard work. So after long conversations, 3 commitments were made this year by CCT. One was to formulate a methodology of some sort to help our churches address polarization. The second was to create spaces to address polarization in the body. And the third was to share a prayer written by those who were present at the forum. So the CCT Steering Committee will offer opportunities for those interested to work on the first 2 areas, and the presidents of the families will work on sending out the prayer with an explanatory cover letter. So, and finally, the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States met online for the 3rd year in a row, October 9 through 11. So since it was online, I don't have photos. The National Council of Churches is a fellowship of about 37 member churches in the United States, representing over 30 million Christians in the country. And they come together as a visible witness to unity and to be a collective voice for transformation in the United States. I'm going to stop sharing there because I don't have any more pictures. But the NCC Christian Unity Gathering happens every year as a time to reflect together, again, on a theme, a time for convening tables to meet, which are sort of like the committees, and a time to take care of the business of the council. So this year's theme had to do with being faithful and serving an unchanging God in the midst of lots of change. There were over 30 United Methodists present online for the event. And I think there were about 110 people in total. The first evening began with an online United Methodist meetup session during which some of the participants introduced ourselves to each other and learned about what would happen during the Christian Unity Gathering. That was followed by evening vespers, a conversation on voter engagement, and a presentation on the challenge of being a public theologian today. The next morning was the time for the full opening worship service, during which a mass choir sang, and Episcopal Reverend Dr. Canon Charles Robertson preached, and Reverend Dr. Cheryl Townsend Gilkeys also preached. The sessions that day were presented, and they were Christian leadership in uncharted territory, which those who are on here from Kentucky will recognize as Todd Bolsinger, dealing with trauma and grief. And then there was an evening online meetup session for anyone interested in learning about what happened at the World Council of Churches Assembly. And Bishop Mary Ann Swenson from the United Methodist Church was our featured speaker for that. The next morning also began with worship. Reverend Eddie Alamein of the Reformed Church in America prayed, and Dr. Jennifer Leith of the AME Church preached. The sessions that day included topics like peace, war, and world hunger, and Ambassador Daniel Speckard spoke for that one. Refugees and hospitality, the future of faith formation, and then a follow-up on Act Now, And so the title of that one was Act Now, Uprooting Racism, White Supremacy, and Christian Nationalism. Dr. Willie Francois and Reverend Pamela Cooper White were the main speakers there, but it was a really good explanation of Christian nationalism. So also that day, an awards ceremony was held, during which time the Reverend Dr. Mozilla Mitchell received the President's Award for Ecumenism, and Reverend Dr. Thomas Duke received the Gibord Award for Interreligious Engagement. Reverend Dr. Joel Gregory of the Baptist tradition preached the closing worship. So after the end of the Christian Unity gathering, the next morning, the NCC governing board met as heads of communion and ecumenical officers, and the interim General Secretary, Bishop Vashti McKenzie, reported on her work to represent the NCC in places as diverse as the Congressional Black Caucus, the World Council of Churches Assembly, Uvalde, and the White House. She's also been working really hard on updating several aspects of the administration of the NCC. And these are the following things I'll end with, were what was passed by the NCC governing board. So there was a motion to update the governing board onboarding manual, a motion to reactivate the think tank to increase young adult involvement, which I'll say I'm thrilled about. A motion to hold a 70th anniversary celebration of the NCC in 2023. A budget of 2023 of $2,152,835. And then nominations for the Friendship Press Board, who, if you don't know, has just put out the NRSV updated edition, which is great. And then nominations for the Christian Education Department Board. So that's my report, speaking very fast. Thank you for listening. And Chris, I will turn it back over to you to field any questions.
Yes, so I would welcome questions from you for Jean. And while you're thinking a little bit about that, Jean, I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about how the consensus gathering worked, because it's a large group of people. Consensus gathering can be difficult even in small groups. So tell us a little bit about that.
Right. Well, like I said, it really is hard work, but the idea is that it's a much more Christian way of being community than voting on things, because in consensus, everybody is able to share their opinion, whether it's verbally or with a card. So everybody gets a blue card, which would indicate being cool toward an idea, and an orange card, which would indicate being warm toward an idea. And as discussions go, and the moderator will call on people just like what we're used to. The moderator will stop every once in a while and say, well, how are we feeling about this? And the cards will go up. And if it's all orange, then they know that consensus has been reached. But if there are maybe one or two blue cards, the consensus moderator will call on those persons to ask them if they would like to say anything. And it's often the person that sees something from a slightly different point of view that will kind of change the whole direction. But those persons are then invited to speak. And usually it's only for like 2 or 3 minutes. There's set rules for that. But that's works, and it is super hard. It was really hard work at CCT this year. And I can talk to people offline about why later.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Are there other questions for Jean? Okay, well, then I want to thank you for taking some time to be together today. It is good to see all of you and to be a part of these conversations as we continue the work in our own conferences, in our own context. Yeah,
I just noticed that Bird Bonner has joined us, and Bird was actually one of the delegates to the World Council of Churches Assembly. So I didn't know, Bird, if you wanted to just say hi and give a minute or two on your impressions.
Well, thank you, Jean. Hi, I'm a layman from San Antonio, Texas. I've been around the ecumenical work within the United Methodist Church and on behalf of the United Methodist Church for really like 35 years now through GCC UIC, and I'm a current member of OCUIR and have been a part of committees at the National Council. I've been on the Penn Methodist Commission for like 20 something years, and now had the great honor of representing the United Methodist Church at the World Council in Germany. It was an interesting process to have the ultimate, I think, diversity of expression of the body of Christ for the world there. Where that played out most vividly was every morning in the about 45-minute to an hour opening worship service each morning. And I don't want to retrench anything that Jean reported because I'm sorry, I was late in coming to the table but today. But I think, and we had an amazing worship book that I have provided, that we were provided it in PDF form. I've provided it to local church worship leaders around my area that I knew would be interested in it. But I think over about probably 8 opening worships, I saw one song that we sang out of 8 times 10, 100 songs that we sang. One was identified as North American, continental North American. There was one from Hawaii, so which does not consider itself North American, but we do consider it American. It was just such a diverse worship, as probably everyone on this Zoom has experienced in ecumenical settings to some degree, but also to have the real testimony, personal testimonies about climate change, about violence against women, global migration. I understand that the home group, which was our midday, every day, the same, about 35 people were assigned randomly into home groups. And we all the delegates met in our home group for an hour and a half every day, midday. Well, people were in and out of home groups because they were also on committees that met or they had other responsibilities. But some of the home groups, I think I've heard, didn't really gel or didn't really have a great experience. I don't know that, but my home group was amazing. I had one woman who was a college professor from Russia, 2 from the Ukraine, plus every continent and major group of Pacific Island and Atlantic Island that were at the assembly. And we had one man from Myanmar. I still think of him, and I've talked to my local congregation and conference about him. A man from Myanmar that was in my group, my home group, who started his journey to Karlsruhe, Germany, 12 days before he got there. Because of civil war in the Myanmar, his visa being canceled, the airport being closed, the airport being barricaded, him finally, and then having trouble with his visa when he was, stopping making connections along the way. Took him 14 days to get to Karlsruhe from Myanmar. And that just hearing him tell about it and him cry about it to us, he was clergy, was just so moving and made such an impression on me. A young laywoman who was from Shanghai, China, and is involved in an ecumenical Christian ministry in Shanghai, just talking about the challenges for a laywoman, for a woman in ministry, for just ministry, period, in China right now, and that they were able to leave China and come to Karlsruhe. That was, and of course, the Ukrainians, it took a lot of negotiation by the interim general secretary going to the Ukraine and convincing the leadership, I think face to face, that they really needed to come. And there were about 12 Ukrainians that I think came.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we're going to have to pull it to a close, Bert. I'm so sorry, but yeah, we
That's okay.
promised to try to keep it to half an hour. I know it was an
I'm
exciting
done. I could go on forever.
I know, it's all good.
It sounds like it was a really, really powerful experience.